Hello everyone. This will be the last video lecture of the semester. It has really been a really long marathon, and I would like to thank you all for your perseverance, for your hard work, for your patience with this class. In the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to offer you a discussion of what is an Islamic city, as our closing lecture, and share with you a case study from a neighborhood of Cairo during the medieval period. We started this class with the earliest cities in ancient Mesopotamia, with Nippur and Uruk, in the alluvial lands of southern Iraq. We traveled to Turkey, we traveled to Iran, highlands of Iran, we traveled to Israel, Palestine, and now we're finally ending our journey in Egypt. In this sense, we're sort of like really like Marco Polo and Kublai Khan in Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, as you recall, visiting various cities of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, like Marco Polo, and thinking of, while we're telling and reading the stories of each of the cities that we studied, we have been also thinking about our own identity, our own, the cities that we grew up, the cities that we live in as well. If you recall, from the end of Marco Polo's discussions, end of Calvino's book, Invisible Cities, the idea was that Marco Polo has always been telling the story of his own city, Venice. So we looked at these representations of cities. We looked at some amazing festivals and urban events that took place in those cities. We learned about collective memory. We learned about landscape, pilgrimage, politics of urban space, nation-state ideologies, and how they used ancient cities today in the contemporary politics. You will recall that we all started actually talking about Islamic cities a while ago, with specific examples here and there. We discussed this idea when we were discussing the idea of the urban fabric and the idea of spontaneously or organically grown cities. We talked about this kind of vernacular mud brick urban fabric as the basic residential neighborhood in the Middle East, particularly in areas with dry and hot climate. Although this can be a little bit of a excessive generalization. The winding alleys and mud brick structures, 2 to 3 story high buildings with courtyards, intimate courtyards with a fountain in the middle, which is your basic climate and ecology adaptation in the hot and dry climates. And this, when we go to the margins, for example, to Turkey, to Caucasus, to in other sections of the Middle East and North Africa, we're actually we see different kinds of adaptations easily. In northern Black Sea region, for example, you see these kind of widely dispersed houses built of wood, particularly, and stone. And so there is quite a bit of variety, but this urban fabric I just wanted to show with these kind of sinuous streets, winding alleys, and cul-de-sacs, and sometimes dead-end streets, bordered by rows of courtyard-centered houses, is the kind of really typical, maybe a little bit stereotypical idea of the Middle Eastern urban neighborhood. Another really interesting contribution of an architectural type to world architecture by Middle Eastern cities is the idea of the souk, the covered bazaar, which actually brings these kind of mercantile structures, corridors and streets of covered sort of merchants with different specializations, different specialties, incredibly colorful and vivid urban commercial life of the city that is still in many places, despite war and other sort of traumas, they're still vivid and colorful. And I'm showing you a photograph from Istanbul's famous Spice Bazaar, or the covered bazaar. This is a kind of a really incredible urban space, still very much alive today. But it came, our understanding is that this kind of structure really came about in this kind of medieval context of the Middle East. But this, I want to contrast this with that of major planned cities, utopian and ideal cities that existed in the early Islamic architecture as well, ideal cities. With the example, we discussed this already with the example of Abbasid Baghdad, this as a newly founded capital city. This is the kind of really original foundation of the city of Baghdad as we know it, with the Caliph's palace and a mosque and congregation mosque or Friday mosque in the middle, and the residential areas that are kind of really surrounding that in a kind of a perfect circle distributed to the various tribes that constituted the Abbasid Caliphate. This kind of orthogonal planning, sort of well-planned structures, is also very typical of early Islamic towns and architecture as well. This applies to the construction of monuments that I'd like to say. This is one of the earliest Islamic monuments we've already discussed when we were covering Jerusalem, if you recall. Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, as we studied this monument built at the Temple Mount site in Jerusalem by the Umayyad dynasty at the time of Abd al-Malik in 691 to 692. And this to commemorate the site that is believed to be Prophet Muhammad's night journey, Miraj, when he traveled to the heavens on his horse Burak and came back. We had seen that monument very much as this was a site also sacred to other monotheistic religions, and as a site which was really right in the middle of this very vibrant late antique Byzantine city. It also incorporated this kind of early Christian Byzantine architectural elements, particularly the construction of a martyrium, a centrally planned martyrium, a circular plan on top of a sacred site or a tomb. And in this case, we have the sacred site of the night journey, the Miraj. And this is also one of the first places of pilgrimage in Islam as well, and where this idea of circumambulation as an Islamic practice of pilgrimage is first practiced. This practice is called tawaf, the circumambulation, and this idea of circling a sacred site as you say prayers. And so for Islamic pilgrimage called Hajj, millions of Muslims go to Mecca and Medina today in Saudi Arabia to perform the tawaf, and also to visit other holy sites of the Islamic past. In its early years, Jerusalem and Mecca, the birthplace of Islam, actually competed to become the main place of pilgrimage for Muslims, and at the end, Mecca was preferred due to its more rooted links to the origins of Prophet Muhammad and the role that Mecca played in Prophet Muhammad's life in that region in Saudi Arabia. And so the Kaaba, the location of the Kaaba is one of the sort of most sacred places for Islam, located Al Masjid Al Haram. This was a space that was taken over from pagan Arab tribes at the time of Muhammad, and it still keeps this ancient stone, the black stone Hajar al-Aswad, an Islamic relic dating to supposedly to the creation of humanity, but also the holy spring of Zamzam here. So let's look at this week's objectives for a moment. First, I'd like to, as we've already started talking about what is an Islamic city, the question really arises: how did early Islamic societies differ from their counterparts in medieval Middle East? Is a continuation of the late antique and Byzantine city, right? How does it relate to that? And thinking that Islam had its beginnings in the 7th century of the Common Era, and about 100 years later, Umayyad dynasty of the Muslim caliphs had actually expanded their territories all the way to Central Asia on the one hand and Morocco and Spain in the Western Mediterranean. How did this early Islamic caliphs transform the cities of the Middle East and the Mediterranean that they conquered? And secondly, in the last few minutes of this video, I'd like to talk about, with the guidance of one of our readings this week by Nazar al-Sayed, on a neighborhood of Cairo, Bain al-Qasrain, and at the time of the Fatimid Dynasty in the 10th and 11th centuries, the construction of a neighborhood and how that neighborhood is transformed through time all the way to the 19th century, to the end of the Ottoman period in that particular area, just as a case study, as a small case study. As I mentioned already, Islam, this third monotheistic religion, with its Prophet Muhammad and its holy scripture Quran, had its beginnings in early 7th century in the city of Mecca, and what is now in Saudi Arabia. The caliphate that became the sort of really strong political arm of Islam was the Umayyad Caliphate, and you're seeing how the expansion of the Islamic world during this during the Umayyad Caliphate here, that was established in 661 of the Common Era, and very powerful until the end of the 8th century, middle of the 8th century, particularly around 750 of the Common Era. The first part of really the sort of political goal of the Umayyad dynasty, the target for Umayyad dynasty was to rule the region known as Bilad al-Sham. We can define this as a kind of a wider sort of Syria, the greater Syria that includes the Levantine coast with Israel and Palestine, and of course this is at this time a very heavily urbanized zone, very prosperous zone with trade, crafts activity, incredible wealth. all throughout history, as we've seen when we were studying other cities here, like Carchemish, and we studied Jerusalem, for example. The Umayyads had trouble so they arrive, and there's already this kind of really extremely established urban tradition, right, in the greater Syria. And how do you attach yourself to an existing multilingual, multi-religious, heterogeneous culture of Syria? And there were a number of ways that they introduced themselves and kind of really transformed these cities as they went through. They also didn't want to really disturb the functioning of this trade from which they already benefited. And one of the major interventions of the Umayyads, they had incredible number of innovations, architectural innovations, but also rather continuities with the late antique and Byzantine traditions here. So one of the impressive interventions in that sense was to build these large-scale mosques for public common prayers. We call these Friday mosques at the height, because as the largest of the congregations during the week in Islam is on Friday at noon. The Great Mosque of Damascus, then I'm going to show you this as an example, is such an early and a spectacular example of early Umayyad architecture. It was built in the place of a Christian basilica dedicated to St. John the Baptist, who was a holy person for both Christianity and Islam. And so they had no problem, the Umayyads had no problem taking over and transforming this basilica into a Friday mosque. And it's believed to be, this is also the site, it was also a holy site itself. It's believed to be that where Prophet Isa, Prophet Jesus, will return at the end of the world. And so it incorporates shrines, including martyrs, two particular martyrs, as well as a mausoleum of the tomb of Saladin. So this idea of a kind of a holy burial in the early Christian basilicas, in the early Christian martyriums, is kind of continued in these Friday mosques as well. More importantly, the Friday mosque also served as a public gathering space, both at prayer and afterwards, and took over some of the function of the public plaza in the Middle Eastern city for celebrations and events, particularly, and festivals. And so the architecture is very much in line with this kind of late antique Byzantine architecture, particularly also with its splendid sort of really stone architecture, and its wall paintings and particularly mosaics. By the end of the 8th century, we mentioned that Umayyads were so successful in the Mediterranean that they had, in spreading Islamic rule, that they had taken over and established political control in Morocco and the southern coast of Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, called Andalusia, during the Muslim rule from 711 onwards. And between 750 and 929, this was the Emirate of Cordoba, and 929 to 1031, the Caliphate of Cordoba. And at this time, Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula, actually became a place of learning, a place that really flourished in terms of cultural and scientific and economic activity, actually. So the construction of, I'm showing you the Great Mosque of Cordoba. It's one of the sort of really most spectacular achievements of the early Islamic rule in the Mediterranean. This congregational mosque at Cordoba was sponsored by the Umayyad ruler of Muslim Spain, Abdul Rahman, from 784 to 787, and it was expanded later in a second phase in the 10th century by Caliph al-Hakam II as well. This kind of polychromatic arches marked with marked voussoirs was really very a really spectacular sort of aspect of Andalusian architecture that is really a significant aspect of Islamic architectural history. Finally, let's go to Egypt. Go back to Egypt. Go to Egypt and go to Cairo. And look at this succeeding Fatimid Dynasty that comes to rule in the 10th and 11th centuries. And the Fatimid Dynasty was an Ismaili Shia dynasty from Tunisia that took control of Egypt in 969 of the Common Era and established their rule by making Cairo, or more specifically Fustat, as their capital city, and named it Al-Qahira, the city victorious, which is the current name. Cairo, Qahira, is the Arabic name for the city. Fustat is located at a crucial geographic point at the northernmost crossing of the Nile, and it was first conquered under the Muslim rule in the 7th century and built as a new town by General Amr ibn al-As. And by the time of the end of the Fatimid dynasty, as actually Fustat was a very large town with about 200,000 people. For that time period, this is a very significant settlement. The Fatimid dynasty really turned Fustat and the city of learning, science, with opening one of the first sort of major universities of human history, and also an enormous library to support that kind of center for higher learning. And this week's reading by Nazar al-Sayad really does a really wonderful job, gives an excellent account of the development of one particular neighborhood in the Fustat that the Fatimids built extensively, known as the Bain al-Qasrain, literally between the two palaces. And this map of Fatimid Cairo shows the location in dark of in a detailed map of this particular neighborhood, Bain al-Qasrain, for you. Al-Sayad, you will note, that has reconstructed from travelers' accounts from different time periods of the development of this neighborhood from the Fatimids all the way to the Ottomans. So he's actually looking at the development of this neighborhood from about 10th century all the way to the 19th century arrival of the sort of Western travelers as well. This is really quite interesting because he works his way both with architectural evidence as well as this literary evidence taken from travelers all the way to the medieval period, and how they are reporting their experience of seeing these cities, very similar to Marco Polo's descriptions of cities. So that should be very familiar to you. It's really nice to end this class really with this note about Marco Polo. And so during the early Fatimid rule, the Fatimid caliphs actually built two palaces in this neighborhood, Bain al-Qasrain, The one that's labeled Great Palace, which is a larger palace structure, referred to as the Great or the Eastern Palace, and a smaller one known as Qasr al-Bahr, and leaving a major kind of orthogonal space between these two palaces. And major ceremonies were held actually in between these two palaces in this plaza that is left between the Bain al-Qasrain, literally between the two palaces, and this space accommodated also thousands of troops on parade and in occasions of festivals and other celebrations. It remained as a formal space for a while, as long as the Fatimids were there, particularly for about 200 years. And you also can note the mosque of the Al-Akbar Mosque that's on top right as well. When the Ayyubid rulers took over the area in the 12th century, to be precise, in 1169 of the Common Era onwards, with the leadership of Salah ad-Din, they introduced three major madrasas that you see here in numbers 1, 2, and 4. Their attempt was gradually to open this royal zone to the public through these institutions of higher learning. A madrasa is a higher education sort of level of a kind of a university, a college actually, and eventually the Ayyubids actually nationalized the Fatimids' royal property here that belonged to the palace, and there was also a major fire. So these events allowed them to kind of really populate this area even more. So that area that is left in the middle, the major sort of rectangular square, was gradually built in. In the succeeding periods, during the Mamluk era and the Ottoman period, that you see on the screen, the area was transformed into an increasingly congested urban landscape of mercantile activity that most people had forgotten the royal and planned aspects of this zone. I'd like to finish my lecture with these three interesting images of Bain al-Qasrain from the 19th to the 20th centuries, early 20th century, from different travelers, and want to remind you about my argument about last week when we were discussing Istanbul, Constantinople, this idea of percolating time in this urban space, this percolation of history, and how as the city is transformed into different urban form, still these traces of different times of prosperity, trauma, decline, renovation that remain in place. And this kind of layered aspect of the urban space really allows us to reach that kind of history if we these images, these traces within the city really is ready to speak. They are ready to speak to us. They're ready to tell their stories if we're willing to listen to them.